Welcome to the Burial Plot Horror Podcast with Brenda Tolian and Joy Yaley.
Hi, and welcome to the Burial Plot. I'm author Joy Yaley, and I'm here with my co-host Brenda Tolian. Today we have a special treat. We have Josh Schlossberg with the Denver Horror Collective, and he's here to tell us about some exciting things that are going on there. And we also are joined by Michael Picco, author of Very Scary Things. Josh and Mike, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
Thank you. I am very glad to be here.
It's good to have you guys. So, Josh, you are a co-founder of the Denver Horror Collective. And for those who are listening who may not know, can you tell us what that is?
Sure. Well, it is a horde of horror creators. We're primarily authors. Of course, Joy and Brenda and Michael are all a part of it. And started back in 2017, basically just as a critique group. And we still have the critique groups, but we've had events. We're a small press publishing house, community network of folks who can communicate on horror-related issues, pretty much all the above and even more.
Great. And do you have to live in Denver to be a member?
We verify everyone's home address by visit. No, you can be anywhere in Colorado. We have people from around the country. It doesn't matter if you want to be in a critique group with people who are in Colorado, come and join us. That's great. But most of the vast majority of the people are, of course, in Colorado, and I would say most people are around the Front Range. But Denver is just a city, and it's a place to coagulate.
Makes sense. Yeah, I'm not actually in Denver either. I am in Colorado, but not Denver.
I don't think any of us on this call are actually in Denver anymore, at least.
No,
so.
I don't think we are. I don't think we are, but we're all in Colorado, but various places. So the Horror Collective has put out 3 anthologies. The first one was Terror at 5280, which was a Denver Post local bestseller, and you were the editor on that one, correct, Josh?
I was the lead editor, so we had a group editing process, but it all eventually came through me. So I guess editor in chief, but it was very much a group collaboration for that. And that was all Colorado authors. All the stories took place in Colorado, primarily around the Front Range. And it was largely, but not entirely, Denver Horror Collective members who had their stories in there. We also, of course, had our headliners, Stephen Graham Jones, who wrote original story, and that story was included in Best Horror of the Year. Later on, Carter Wilson co-wrote a story with Josh Viola. So had some big names, and then some folks who have been published for quite a while, and then folks who it was their first publication.
That's great. And then the second anthology is Consumed Tales Inspired by the Wendigo, that was edited by Holly and Henry Snyder, I believe. But I think you also had your hand in that one as well. Is that correct?
Well, I'm trying to show it, but the virtual background won't allow it. So just imagine what it looks like. But I was only copy editor for Consumed Tales Inspired by the Wendigo. Holly and Henry Snyder were the editors. They did the whole process of story selection and editing the stories and everything like that. I was also the publisher, so putting the pieces together and getting it out there into the world. But that was their baby. That was their idea. And they pretty much executed that on their own. And yeah, that's another great anthology. Wrath James White, Steve Rasnick Tem, Dana Fredste were the headliners, and then 15 other folks were in that anthology, which people love that. People love the anthology.
And that brings us to where we are today. We're on the third anthology from the Denver Horror Collective that you are the editor of, and that is the Jewish Book of Horror, which will be launched on, of all great days, Halloween.
That is correct. It will be out through various conduits online We got it, of course, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Apparently Target has picked it up.
Nice.
I don't know how that happened or why or what that even means, but that's the case. It will be a pre-release of the ebook on godless.com. Ironically, the Jewish Book of Horror on Godless. We're bringing a little bit of Yahweh to Godless, but the paperback and Kindle and stuff like that, and it's on Nook, and apparently it's on Kobo and Scribd, whatever the hell that is. I didn't even do that, so I don't know. Somebody might be stealing it and putting it up there. I don't know. I can't spend any more time on it, so buy it, and so I can do other things.
So this is the second anthology that you've been the head editor of, so to speak. And I'm just curious, a lot of us, we, submit to anthologies, but we've never put one together. And I was just kind of wondering if you could give us kind of an idea of what it's like to put together an anthology.
Well, I can only tell you what it's like for me to put together an anthology, which may not be the same for others. With Terror at 5280, although I was the lead editor, I had many other folks' feedback and involvement. For the Jewish Book of Horror, I didn't listen to anyone. So that one's all me. And no, I did have some advisors for sure, several people. I mean, I talked to Gary Roby about components of it just in general, because he's been in the writing game for a long time. I talked to John Baltusberger, who I call the Moses of Jewish horror, because he sort of led the way. He had put out an anthology a few years ago, a Jewish horror anthology, a smaller one, but an excellent one. And I even stole a couple of the writers from there to write new stories for this one. And he's been writing a lot of Jewish horror. So, but other than that, yeah, it was pretty much all me. And what it was like was me reading stuff and seeing what I liked. That's any editor who is pretending that it's some mathematical equation is lying to you or themselves, or probably both. But I did, so I have my tastes, right? So whatever tickles my fancy. I have a pretty decent knowledge of Judaism. I grew up as a conservative Jew, going to conservative synagogue. I went to Hebrew day school from basically nursery school until sixth grade. I got my bar mitzvah. I studied the Holocaust a bit in college and afterwards. So I have a decent knowledge. So I knew, okay, this is a good smattering of what can be offered. I also, of course, wanted to make sure we got a bunch of cool different aspects just in terms of horror. So I wanted a variety of aspects of Judaism and things that are unexpected. But I wanted, like, okay, here's a monster, here's a demon, here's just a general supernatural, here's sort of noir. So I wanted to have a whole variety of that. And I wanted to surprise people too. So didn't want it to be all Golem stories. But of course, we have Golem story, but it'll surprise you. And so many great submissions came in. So honestly, I mean, this sounds so cliche, and if I heard somebody else saying it, I'd probably roll my eyes, but it's true. The hardest part was deciding which ones to go in and which really good stories to get rid of. So I got rid of some excellent stories, and it made me feel better about my own rejections for my own writing, because I'm like, here I am actually rejecting some excellently written stories because, oh, well, we already have a story about this, and that story also has this, or I wanted to make sure that that person was featured, whatever. So yeah, it's not just about the quality of the story. It's, does it fit into the anthology based on what else is in there? There may be some other aspects in it. There were definitely some stories by less experienced writers, but it was a really cool idea and it hadn't been represented. So I helped a bit more to hone that story, which they may or may not have appreciated, but that's what the editor gets to do. So that was mostly my experience. It was just kind of figuring stuff out as I went along, trying to be really fair, and at the same time, well, we want a certain representation. I definitely wanted primarily Jewish authors, but not exclusively, and so that factored in. But I really enjoyed that process, even though it was difficult. And yeah, there were incredible stories. We had over 80 submissions, which we were talking earlier, for a Jewish horror anthology, that's a lot of submissions, right? For a very specific topic like this, most people would not feel confident tackling such a thing. And we had tons of stories and so many good ones, and I just ended up choosing 22. So a quarter of them, three-quarters of them are gone forever. No, probably not gone forever.
Would you consider well, depending on how this one does, a volume 2?
People buy enough copies, perhaps. So
Get out there and buy copies, people. Well, I mean, it's already getting really good reviews. Publishers Weekly, let me see, I have a quote from them. They said, Schlossberg brings together a superior anthology with a fascinating origin story that ably demonstrates the compatibility of Jewish tradition, history, and folklore with the horror genre. This is sure to please fans of folklore-infused horror.
let's
That's
hope so.
quite the that's quite the ringing, I think, endorsement of this book.
Yeah, the fact that Publishers Weekly, which is called the Bible of the literary world, ironically, that's what they actually call themselves that. So that's pretty funny. So that's a great sign that the mainstream world is at least tolerating this. So that's all I can hope for. But I wanted to ask Michael. I'm not the host here, but I'm asking other guest questions, I guess. But Michael, I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about the submission process, and so when you saw the call for submission, what did you think?
Well, I was a newly minted Denver Horror Collective member at the time that the call came out, and I, I saw it as an incredible challenge. I mentioned in my story that I'm not a member of the Jewish faith. I don't follow any faith, and so writing a story with that, the weight of all that history, was very daunting, to say the least. It was a very challenging story for me to write, both from an emotional perspective and for a logistical perspective, and not to mention the fact that the date of submission was fast approaching. I think I wrote this, within the span of about 6 or 7 weeks, so which is a record for me.
Well, I was definitely impressed by your story, and I actually got to see it in the critique group. And
Yes, they were enormously helpful.
I was like, okay, this one's definitely going to be in, because you took a really unique take on the Holocaust with a very interesting creature, a biblical monster in a sense. And I had not really heard of that before. So it got the surprise factor for me. And it was a Holocaust story. It's like, man, all right, I'm going to have one. Which am I going to do? And yours was the best, and it covered it with a lot of empathy, and it brought a new thing to it. It wasn't like the same story that at least I, as a Jewish person, heard over and over again, that I didn't necessarily want to rehash ad nauseum. You have the aspects, the historical aspects, that I again learned things about. I remember looking at an aspect that I won't even bother getting into, but I'm sure you remember, and thinking to myself, oh, he misunderstood some of the historical aspects. Then I looked it up and I was like, oh no, Michael was totally right. I was wrong. It was about the town and all that. But yeah, Michael had his history down impeccably. And that was what was interesting about the non-Jewish participants. Is my guess is they felt like there was a higher bar for them, which in a sense there might have been, and
Absolutely.
they all delivered. Because it's one thing to just be grandfathered into Jewish, but like to actually care enough about it to learn about it, that gets a lot of credit in my book.
So, Michael, I have a question for you as well. Did that you said you wrote it within 6 and 7 weeks, but how long did the research take you to make sure that you were getting the details correct?
Oh, that's all crammed into that 6-week period. I sat and would read all kinds of books on the various internment camps, and sift through some of the documentaries. There's actually a memorial site for the Raisenstadt on the web where you can go and do like a virtual tour of the grounds and everything. And I went and did that, and plagued my local librarian. I have a friend who's a librarian here, just plagued her for materials, stuff to read. There was one book in particular that kind of had a kind of Anne Frank kind of sort of flavor to it. And, that kind of informed how I wrote the story, was as, kind of a journal.
It was an effective choice, I think, in your story for sure. So we can't talk about this book without talking about the cover. The cover is so eye-catching and just so amazing. I don't know, just brag on it for us. Tell us how it came about and maybe who the artist is. That would be great to know.
Yeah, so I did it through a thing called 99 Designs. So you basically outsource a contest. And at first it seems like a little unfair, but that's just how things are. So basically you put out a certain amount of money, and then half of it goes to the website Place 99 Designs, half of it goes to the artist, which is where it's kind of, I don't know if it's a ripoff or whatever. And people send in designs, and then you basically can rate them and give them feedback. And there were a lot of really cool ones, and I gave them an idea of what I wanted. So this concept behind the origin of this is, I might be reading about that later, I'm not sure, but basically the concept is that Moses, who we have there, right? Moses for the Ten Commandments, except that's not what that is. There was a time before he spoke to God in the burning bush, according to this origin story, where he was a little crazy, let's just say. And he wandered around the desert, and then he went into a cave, and he came back with this black volcanic rock with stuff written on it. And he read out the titles to the townsfolk, and bad things happened to them, as are occurring in that picture there. And then he went out and he buried it back in the desert. But some people remembered it and told the tales. And then I got everyone to rewrite the stories from that original tome. And that's what the Jewish Book of Horror is. So what we have here is Moses during his crazy period with the Jewish Book of Horror over his head and basically threatening people with it. And people are aghast and fainting. And that's basically it. And there's a desert down there. And so HRM Designs was who did it. It was a human I contacted, but I forget their name. But they wanted HRM Designs was the thing they wanted anyway. So HRM Designs for your Jewish horror needs. otherwise, no, they're an excellent entity. And yeah, there were just so many cool designs, plays on that original Moses at the Mount that I wanted to have, which was so iconic. And I played around with some other ideas that might have been more silly, but like, a dreidel with razors and stuff like that. But this one, I was like, all right, people are going to know what that is right away. And then they'll look closer and what the hell's wrong with the 10 Commandments? And I deliberately wanted them to be distorted. And it's the only way I feel like I have a good conceptual idea of what can make good images, but I can't draw for shit. So I have to get people who are professionals, but I'm decent at guiding them to make a concept, but I have no ability to do anything like that. So I don't get to claim credit for that amazing cover.
Yeah, it is an amazing cover. That when you first revealed that, I was just like, oh my gosh, just the shading and the lighting and the layering.
Yeah.
Totally draws your attention. It's worth, I can't wait for my paperback copy to come so I can just stare at that picture for a little while.
Yeah, it came out really great. And again, that was not me. I don't understand graphic design. Michael does. And Michael actually did you're not gonna be able to see it because none of this works, but he did a Jewish star, like that is the art throughout. I forget what you even call it. It's just like the graphic thing, you put at the end of the stanzas, and I don't know, I should know these words. I forget.
The scene breaks.
Scene breaks. That's it. Editor great editor here. But yeah, so Michael made it. It's like a slash Jewish star, and like again, he made it all symmetrical at first. I'm like, make it asymmetrical. It all has to be asymmetrical because asymmetry is scary, right? So then he made this really cool one, and it's throughout the Jewish Book of Horror. That's perfect. So that's my other involvement with just art stuff I can't do, but I can tell people what to do with their skills.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize that Mike had done the interior on that. That's great. That's a
Yep.
really cool looking little icon.
He's listed there. Star of David graphic, Michael
Nice.
Picco.
Yep.
Good job.
It was a nice little inclusion. I was happy to do it.
Yep. Well, it was basically to compensate us for having to put the footnotes into your story, because that was a pain in the ass. It's like, footnotes, what am I supposed to do with this? But luckily Henry Snyder, who did the layout, he was able to do all that, because I just sort of threw in a Word doc. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. So that was more Henry's work to fix that.
Well, he has my thanks. I know what a pain in the ass they are.
I think we did them justice, though. So
Absolutely.
So of all the encompassing things that go on with building an anthology, Josh, what was your most challenging piece of bringing this anthology to life?
Well, I mean, if I'm being completely honest and not interesting, it's just the process of layout, because we had to go back and forth a bit with it, and I was going to do it. Here I was all confident. Yeah, I know Henry was doing this. I'll figure it out. I'll get this subscription to InDesign, and this will be a piece of cake. I couldn't do it. I couldn't even open the program for an hour. And then finally I got to it, and it was like all this weird, like it didn't show up on the page as it, and I was like, all right, I'm out of my element. Henry, can you please do it all? And so Henry did that all. And so we had a few back and forth where I, changed, things needed to be switched. So that's just like the logistics of the technical stuff. Nothing very interesting, but it just shows there are these skills. I have certain skills, a certain set of skills, but they're not the drawing, and I don't know how to do the layout. So this is really a group project. So if I could have, yes, put a thing together in the Word doc and then like scribbled a cover, but no one would buy it and it would look like shit. So that's why it's really a group project, even for something that I anally controlled every detail.
It's a huge and heavy lift producing a book. And you're right. It is a group. It is a group lift, because it's brain damage to do it on your own.
Yeah, there's a lot, and at a certain point, realizing you can't make things perfect. There are a few minor details I might switch up in the future. I realize I might, since we got the Publisher's Weekly quote, and if we get some other quotes, I might put something on the cover. So, maybe in the new year, I'll fix my little anal things that no one else notices but me. But it's a good practice to just let that be. But yeah, there's so many damn details that go into it. And the editing of the stories themselves was not, I don't, that wasn't hard. Like it took work, but it wasn't hard for me. And I mean, folks can be the judge of whether I should have spent more time or not, but I enjoyed that process. I enjoyed some of them. I barely, a few words here, and then some I helped rewrite to a certain degree, and then most were kind of in the middle. But that part of the process, yeah, I really enjoyed that.
So, Josh, one of the things about this book that drew my attention almost immediately was your origin tale of how this came about. And I was hoping that you would share that with listeners.
I will share it by reading it from the book. How about that? Okay, so this is the preface, and it is called Origins of the Jewish Book of Horror. In the days when Moses dwelt in the desert of Midian, years before God spoke to the patriarch out of a burning bush, a sickness of the brain befell him. Mad Parched and sunstroked, Moses wandered the sands until in the wilderness he came upon a lone mountain of black stone, a cave at its base. Seeking shelter, he entered and went deep into the bowels of the earth. For a full day, he was gone only to emerge in the middle of the night, hefting a boulder of black volcanic stone, a miniature of the mountain itself, 22 phrases engraved upon its face. Moses trudged home in a daze, the heavy rock in his arms like a dead body. Upon reaching his camp, he gathered his neighbors around him and read them the contents of the stone. One by one, all who heard the words fell to the ground with much shrieking, writhing, weeping, and gnashing of teeth, with blood, vomit, and other foulness leaking from such places as they should not. Many perished, the rest lost their minds. As Moses came to his senses, the meaning of the dark words finally dawned on him, and he lugged the boulder back out to the desert to bury beneath the shifting sands. But a few of the survivors remembered the profane phrases and passed them down over the ages. These are the tales they told. Stunned and slightly nauseous, I set the thin stack of printouts down on the coffee table where I'd found them. I ran my fingers over the message scrawled in shaky cursive at the top of the page. To the eldest grandchild, share these pages with the world, wondering what in hell was going on. As I stood in the brand new lobby of Temple Sinai, the voice of the elderly rabbi chatting with my mother droned from around the corner. We had just finished our personal tour, starting with the plush yet tasteful love seat and armchairs, walnut coffee table, and sky blue carpet, all gifts from my grandparents to their synagogue, a small bronze plaque on the wall bearing their names. Perhaps it was the fact that I am indeed the eldest of my grandparents' 10 grandchildren, and a horror author and editor to boot, that made me pick up the manuscript again, sit down in one of the chairs, and keep reading. The 22 stories, if you could call them that, were like bare bones folk tales told by illiterates. True? Allegory? Somewhere in between? I had no idea. But as I made my way through the disturbing pages, it was as if I had been sucked deep into a whirlpool, an unnavigable gulf of blackness opening between me and where my mother spoke with the holy man down the hall, that only spat me out again when I was done. I have even less of an excuse for tucking the manuscript in the back of my pants and taking it with me. All I know is that at the time, it seemed like the thing to do. As soon as I got back to my grandparents' house, I went online and searched for clues, quoted entire passages. I found nothing. Figuring I had accidentally stolen some fledgling but talented horror writer's first draft, I hid the pages away in a drawer and forgot all about it. Sadly, a few years later, my grandfather passed away. And last winter, my grandmother left us as well. In helping to clean out their house, I found the manuscript again, and a strange compulsion overcame me. I needed to publish it. Of course, it was far too rough as it was, the stories barely readable. Instead, I chose 22 authors, most Jewish, some simply with connections to our people and traditions, and asked each of them to rewrite one of the stories in their own words. The final draft was as nightmarish, if not more so, than the manuscript. And I'd argue the tales are even more true to the original titles, hewn into crazy Moses' black stone. And that's the story of the Jewish Book of Horror. To be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure why I brought it to Denver Horror Collective, and certainly not what will come of it. All I know is, as it's finally out of my hands, it feels like a weight has been lifted from me, as if I too had been carrying that boulder all this time. And now what you do with it, dear reader, is entirely up to you.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
That's
bravo.
great. Yay!
Thank you.
And now, Mike, we were going to ask you if you would read from your story that's in this anthology. The horse leech has two maws.
Certainly.
But you have an interesting monster, so to speak, in it. And it was something that was kind of new to me. You pulled it out of Proverbs, and I don't, people do know this about me, that I used to work in ministry. I had to go back and reread to see if that was really in there, because it just never registered with me, that word.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about that and the background of that?
Sure. And, I'm going to have to do kind of a little bit of a deep dive into translations and what have you with this. My original thought with this story was I always wanted to write a vampire story that had some kind of biblical link to it. And, I was doing some research on that and happened upon this passage, which is from the book, from the words of Agar, who was a Arab scribe who translated this particular section of Proverbs. And aluk, I think it is Arabic for horse leech. So that's what we're seeing in that particular passage is actually a mistranslation, because the aluka is an entirely different creature altogether. But that's the translation that made it through. But if you go back to the original, the aluka is a creature of vampiric origin. It has a lot of roots in the daughters of Lilith and or demonic lore. So it's quite an interesting creature, and it only appears just in this one place in the whole Bible, which I thought was fascinating. Because the Bible's full of all sorts of horrific things. Why shouldn't it have a vampire, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So when I was writing this, I had to figure out, the passage that I quoted was from Proverbs 30, verses 14 through 16, and of course it is metaphorical here. When they're talking about the horse leech having two maws, they're talking about the hunger of the grave and the extent of drought and how fire consumes everything. So it's got that metaphorical aspect. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to take that description and apply it literally to an actual creature, something that has both demonic origins to it and kind of a vampiric kind of tint to it. And that's where I came up with this creature that kind of satisfied both of those two things. It's actually from a Malaysian folklore called Panagolint. And the Panagolins are these horrible, like semi-demonic creatures. They're actually witches that have consorted with a devil or a demon and have obtained these abilities. But they're cursed creatures, like vampires often are. They're cursed. And these creatures, their heads will actually detach from their bodies, and they'll drag their viscera out with them, and then the heads kind of fly around in this flurry of hair, and just it's a horrifying scene, as you can imagine, this horrible thing. And then they drink the blood of the unwary around them. So I thought that was a particularly gruesome creature, and it fit the criteria of having demonic origins, like the Aluka in the Bible. So I thought I'd introduce that into this story. So it's not your prototypical European type of vampire, although it does share a lot of the characteristics of a European vampire. I think you'll find that when you study vampire lore, several things keep, there's several characteristics that keep kind of popping up. And the Aluka or the Panagolint are no exception to that.
Gotcha on that. That's terrifying, actually. That's really horrible. The two maw parts. So there's an inner mouth and an outer mouth. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, exactly. And that has precedence in vampire lore. You see the introduction of pharyngeal jaws, which is what those are called. Pharyngeal jaws are often associated with like the alien with its secondary jaws that kind of pop out and snap at you. But they're found in nature in a number of animals, particularly the eel. The eel has pharyngeal jaws, and what it does is it latches on with one set of jaws, and then a second set kind of comes in and draws it down the gullet. So, this phenomenon is not unknown in nature. And to be honest, there is an annelid worm that has two suckers on each end, but in that particular case, one is just meant for attachment to its host, and the other one bites and sucks at the wound. So, I'm drawing different aspects of different creatures into this one creature to kind of make it fit that. You see these secondary jaws, these pharyngeal jaws, or this kind of tubular maw that I describe in here in a couple of recent movies in the vampire genre. You see it in Blade 2, which was released in 2002. You see it in the Reaper vampire strain, where there's a long, protruding kind of a proboscis sort of thing that actually attaches to the victim and draws the blood out there. And then you also see it a little bit more pronounced in the strain, which was released in 2014, and with the Strigoi. And they, of course, use that primarily. The primary jaws don't bite at all. It's all that proboscis. So I wanted to employ that with the Panagolint, simply because, they have their viscera kind of dangling out. So I was wondering, what could they use to kind of attach? They can't grab onto their prey, so they have to attach one way or another. And the best way to do that would be with a proboscis or a pair of pharyngeal jaws, where one could bite and the other could suck at the wound.
Well, that's terrifying.
That's what I was going for.
So, in the spirit of Halloween and being terrifying, we would really love it if you would read some of that story for us.
I'd be happy to. And I will say in advance, please forgive my German. It's not as good as it used to be, but I'll do my best. So if I butcher something, don't write me angry letters. I was going to read down to the middle of page 2, if that's okay.
That's perfect.
Okay. So this is The Horse Leech Has Two Maws. Excerpted from the Journal of Michael Schloss, Theresienstadt's Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have teeth like swords and fangs like knives. They devour the poor from the earth and the needy from among humanity. The Aluka have two maws, one that bites and another that suckles at the wound. Always they cry out, "More, give us more." And as I mentioned, that's from the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, chapter 30, verses 14 through 16. They came with us. They came with us, moving from body to body in the fetid twilight of the cattle cars, shifting, changing, feeding, masquerading first as children, as misshapen dwarfs, as shrunken old women. They came with us as we huddled and cried and grieved, crawling over our bodies like so much vermin as the death trains plodded towards our extinction. They came with us, those things, those terrible, dreadful things, the daughters of Lilith, Panagolint, Wampir, Aluka. I wouldn't have believed it, at least not before I arrived here. I would have called those who have seen them delusional, mad even, but I too have seen them. I too have felt their raw caresses, their terrible kisses deep in the dark on those nights when the wind howls and the thunder of the artillery booms off in the distance. I've seen them in those bitter hours before dawn, when cold numbed my limbs and the night spilled from the windows, filling my eyes with darkness. I've seen them on those nights when the snow sifted past the gaps in the walls and frost rimed the crude berth on which I lay. Yes, I have seen them. God help me, I have seen them. They metastasize out of the shadows, scuttling over the walls, arising from between the rough boards, the emaciated limbs, the black bars, stealing from the in-between places that no one ever sees. Even in the stillness of the night, their inky hair churned in a frenzy around their faces, wild and tangled with the darkness. How they whispered and chittered among themselves, gasping, slavering at the bounty before them. Their disembodied heads held aloft by ethereal currents, their pendulous viscera drooping from their ragged necks as they darted among the rafters, oozing a foul and odorous bile in their wake. Their eyes, oh, their horrible, horrible eyes, gave no light. They seemed only to absorb it. They drew out my vitality with their gaze, leaving me bereft of warmth or any strength to resist them. They take and they take and they take, giving you back nothing. They leave you weak, exhausted, addled, weary. Yes, so very, very wearily. The other prisoners, the ones from the old world, referred to them as the Aluka, which roughly translates to the horse leeches. Though they feed like leeches, they are not. No, they are not. There's something far worse. There's something ancient and terrible, something spun from the sticky webs of fever dreams. There's something from a time, a world long lost and utterly beyond our mortal kin.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see why Josh chose that story. Such a beautiful, terrible language. Paints such a picture. I think for me, when I first read that story, just the image of being in the cattle car and seeing these things sort of moving amongst the people, it's already terrifying enough, but then you add that layer of horror on top of it. And I think it just paints a really interesting picture. And your character is interesting as well. It was a nice viewpoint
Oh,
from
thank
the
you.
Holocaust and very well done.
The cattle cart scene came from a dream that I had, and I was held upright. People were pressed against me. I was held upright, and I couldn't move. My arms were kind of down at my sides, and I kept feeling something like move between my legs, and it was like loose hair, and then it would just bite me. It just and I'd cry out, and people would say, "Oh, it's near, it's near," and then it would go away, and I would sit, and I tremble. I was just so upset about it, and then it would happen to somebody else, and people would cry out. It was a horrible nightmare. But that's where the initial scene came from. Was from that dream.
It's very reminiscent of a lot of the first person memoirs from the Holocaust,
Mhm.
which has that realism component to it, because that's a lot of the storytelling that we've gotten. Every Elie Wiesel Night, or something I read as a kid, which is Mouse. It was this comic books
Mhm.
about the Holocaust, but I learned a lot from that. It was obviously not making fun of the Holocaust, but
Oh.
the Germans were cats, the Jews were mice,
Mhm.
the well, we don't have to get in what the other one people
It's
were, because
it's a brilliant piece of work.
yeah. Well, so something you should mention though, Michael. So your main character, though, despite the fact that he is being brought to the camps, he is not Jewish.
Correct. He was part of the Germans' anti-social program, which targeted uh, homosexuals in particular, but also the Roma, uh, otherwise known as the Gypsies. Um, a lot of the disabled people, um, people of color. There was a very wide net of people that they detained, and Michael Schloss, my narrator, was one of those. He finds his redemption in that he is a very well known violist in Germany, and his celebrity kind of keeps him a little bit insulated from the worst of what the camp has to offer. But he still suffers greatly.
Yeah, it was a really moving story. And again, as somebody who has researched this and then has to have the final say about, okay, what is tasteful, what do I allow in this, I'm very happy to have that story as the sole Holocaust story, because it has everything, and then it has that other angle into it. And it's like, well, yes, it was primarily Jews, but not entirely Jews, and this whole concept of the other, which is what Holocaust is all about, and what Jewish persecution was all about. And it's a history that Jews share with any number of persecuted people throughout the ages, based on ethnicity, religion,
Hmm.
in inborn sexual predilection, anything like that.
Hmm. Yeah. I mentioned that in the story. I say I did not. The narrator, my voice comes through the narrator and says, I did not share my partner's fate. His partner's a man named Amon or Armand, and he says I did not share his fate, but I shared his fate. And he kind of goes on to say, and the fate of the Jewish people. So there was that. Um, it I found out that the Nazis were targeting people from all walks of life much later in my studies of the Holocaust. That wasn't an initial thing. So I kind of wanted to shine a bit of a spotlight on that. Um, that small sliver of the population that was there for that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all relevant. And yeah, I mean, obviously as a non-Jew writing about Jewish subjects, this is also like a safe way to do it. But
Yes, yeah. Well, as I told one of the people in the critique group, she goes, "Well, why didn't you make him Jewish?" And I said, "Well, I think I can pull off a gay Jewish musician, but not a um, gay Jewish German musician."
Hmm.
I had to kind of narrow my scope a little bit. The and it was a stretch to get just that, get his voice down. You know, uh, I think a lot of us as writers, we struggle with our characters' voices, and we know what they want to say, but they have their own story to tell. And I felt that was a good compromise between the two.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it worked really well.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
it's extremely effective, extremely effective. And it was actually a very moving story, not only terrifying, but moving. Um,
Good.
to just sort of, I knew that other people had been targeted, but to just sort of get in their shoes and sort of live the experience with them, I thought it was very well done and
Thank
very
you.
scary. Very
Thank
scary.
you.
Nice job.
It's
Well,
it was an honor to be in there.
yeah, I got to take a preview peek of it, just kind of looking at layout for Josh, and I could not put it down. Couple of the stories actually, like very few things disturb me to the point where I can't sleep, but did have one or two restless nights after having read through some of these because of the imagery that it brought up for me. And my dad was a World War II vet, and he was one of the first GIs in to liberate a camp. And he never spoke of it until later in his life, till I was an adult. And some of the things that he would tell me, I mean, I had all these images because I have an active imagination, obviously, I'm a writer. So there were a few stories in there that just the imagery was almost overwhelming. And I did have a couple of nights where I couldn't sleep. So I was like, well done.
Mhm.
Yep.
Mhm.
And
Well done.
we did try to balance the dark with the light. There are definitely some lighter stories in there, including almost comedic stories. One in particular that's basically about a Lovecraftian Hanukkah cult,
Yeah.
and there are definitely some lighter. The thing I knew I had to do, I'm like, all right, after Michael's story, I need to have a bit lighter one to lighten the room up a little bit after that. But I tried to do that. I tried to do heavy light, heavy light, heavy light as much as I could. But yeah, they're all horrors, so they're all going to be dark to a certain extent. But I hope redemptive at the end
Mhm.
is my hope, and I leave it on a I think a pretty I knew this story that was gonna be last, like as soon as I read it. It was about a Jewish grandmother, and my grandmother had just passed away, and all that stuff was on my mind. And like I read it, I'm like, oh, this is obviously this is the one. We got to have the Jewish bubby basically fighting a demon devil thing, and so that's the last story,
Yeah,
which
no,
I'm not giving anything away. It's basically in the title. So
I thought that was effective. Yeah, and it did end kind of on a where you can, oh, okay, sort of note. So no, I think the balance is really, really great, and just the collection of stories is amazing. Um,
great.
I think everybody should go get a copy of this.
Me too. What do you
Go
know?
get your copy, people. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing the Jewish Book of Horror with us. I think I see great success in its future. Great writing inside. The cover catches your eye. Like I said, I'm going to stare at it for a little while after it comes. I would like to get a print of it, frankly. I think it's amazing. Mike, thanks for reading your story and sharing your knowledge with us. It was
My pleasure.
really enjoyable. And Josh, this book will be out officially on Halloween. Is that correct?
Yep, pre-release ebook through godless.com, and then everywhere else, go to Target apparently and pick up the copy on Halloween. But yeah, pretty much wherever you can find books, lots of bookstores will be carrying it. If not, you can go to indiebound.org and have them carry it. And you can also find out all the links and ways to find the book at denverhorror.com. So we have the project page up there where you can just find an easy way in, and also post some stuff about things related to it on my personal website, joshsworstnightmare.com. And you can find Denver Horror Collective and Josh's Worst Nightmare on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I have a podcast as well where I talk about some related stuff, but mostly biological horror. Like how I just crammed all those pitches in there.
Good for you. We will put links to all of that in the show notes so people can find you easily. And Mike, where can folks find you and your work?
On my website, I'm a one-stop shop. So Michael Picco with 2 C's, PICCO.com.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen, and good luck with the book. I think it will do very well. Listeners, thank you again for joining us. I can be found at joyyaley.com, and Brenda can be found at brendatolian.com, as always. Until next time, listeners, stay above ground.